3 foals, 1 woman, and 40 miles of snow that didn't care about either. I've told this story maybe 100 times, and every time I get to the part where I first saw her, my voice does something I can't control. Because I didn't ride out that morning looking for a hero. I rode out to count my dead. That's what a rancher does after a blizzard. You go out with a full flask and an empty stomach, and you brace yourself to find the animals the storm took while you slept warm. What I found instead was a woman kneeling in a snowdrift up to her waist, holding a newborn filly against her chest like it was the last warm thing left on earth. 2 more foals shivered behind her. She wasn't from my valley. She wasn't from any place that would have owed us a single thing. And by every rule of that hard country, she should have kept walking and saved herself. She didn't. What she did over the next 3 days changed how an entire valley of stubborn, suspicious, half-frozen ranchers looked at each other, and at her. Some of us are ashamed of who we were before she came. Some of us are just grateful. If you've ever wondered what real courage looks like, not the loud kind, not the kind with a rifle and a speech, but the quiet kind that kneels in the snow and refuses to let something small die alone, then stay with me. Because I'm going to tell you exactly what I saw, and I'm going to try for once to tell it right. Her name, I would learn, was Nature's granddaughter, but that comes later. Let me start where it started, in the white. The wind that January had a sound I'd never heard before and haven't heard since. Not a howl. Howling I could have slept through. This was lower, steadier. A long dragging moan like the mountain itself was pulling something heavy across the sky and couldn't set it down. My father, God rest him, used to call weather like that the kind that thins a man out. I didn't understand what he meant until I was 31 years old, and staring out my one good window at a valley that had gone from brown to white to nothing at all in the space of an afternoon. I'm Elias Warwick. I still run, technically, though there's less to run these days, a cattle operation on the north shoulder of what folks around here call the Ashwater Valley, on account of a creek that runs gray with volcanic silt every spring. 240 head in a good year. That January was not a good year. Let me be honest with you the way I wasn't honest with myself back then. I was not a kind man in those days. I want you to know that going in, because the whole point of this story is a woman who was, and if I paint myself soft it cheapens what she did. I was tight-fisted. I was suspicious of anyone who wasn't born within sight of my chimney smoke. When the Chiricahua family started wintering in the low country south of the pass, pushed there, the way everyone got pushed then, by things bigger than any of us, I did what most of the valley did. I locked my smokehouse. I counted my horses twice. I said things at the feed store that I would give a great deal now to take back. So understand, when the storm broke on the 3rd night and I woke to that low dragging moan and knew, the way you know, that I'd lost animals, I did not ride out that morning with a good heart. I rode out with a ledger in my head. 14 head near the Aspen Draw, most likely gone. The 2 orphan foals I'd been nursing since their dam died in December, near certainly gone. I'd already grieved them in my sleep, the way you learn to. I kept a little book. I should mention that. A green cloth notebook I carried in my breast pocket, and I wrote down numbers in it, always numbers, never words, because words felt like a thing that could be used against you. Head of cattle, cords of wood, dollars owed, dollars owing. My wife, before she passed, used to tease me that I'd write down my own last breath if I could get the pencil to it in time. I mention the book because it matters later. It's the thing I was holding when I first saw her, and it's the thing I couldn't bring myself to write in for a long while after. The snow had stopped just before dawn. That's the cruelest trick of those storms. They let up right when the cold gets its teeth in deepest, so the sky goes clear and blue and beautiful, and it's 20 below and the beauty is trying to kill you. I saddled Dell, my old gray gelding, the only horse with sense enough not to fight the drifts, and we went out into all that terrible blue quiet. I found the 14 head first. I'll spare you. Cattle don't die pretty in the cold. I stood there a while and I took out the green book and my hand was shaking too hard from the cold to write, so I just put it back. 14. I'd tally them proper at the house. It was on the ride back, cutting across the low bench where the wind scours the snow thin, that Dell stopped. Just stopped. Ears forward, head high, breath coming out of him in two long gray plumes. I've had that horse 11 years. He doesn't spook and he doesn't beg, and when he stops like that it means look. So I looked. Down in the swale below the bench, where the drifts piled deep against the old fence line, there was a shape that didn't belong. Dark against all that white. Too small for a cow, too still for a moving thing, and I remember my first thought was grim and practical. A downed animal, another number for the book. I clucked Dell forward and we picked our way down, and the shape resolved, the way things do, into something my mind refused for a full 3 seconds to accept. A woman, on her knees in a drift that came up past her waist, and she wasn't dead, wasn't down, she was working. Her whole body was bent over something, her arms moving in a slow, steady rhythm, and as I got close I saw what it was. She had a foal. A newborn, wet, dark, and impossibly small, laid across her thighs to keep it off the snow, and she was rubbing it, long firm strokes down its neck and barrel, the way you do to bring a chilled newborn back, to remind its blood to move. She'd taken her own outer robe off to wrap the thing. In that cold, she'd stripped her own back to wrap a horse. And behind her, pressed into the little windbreak of her body and a leaning fence post, 2 more foals. 2 more. All 3 of them the get, I realized with a lurch. Of the mares I thought I'd lost in December, or no, that wasn't right either, the timing was wrong. These were too new. My mind was scrambling. Where had 3 newborn foals come from in the dead heart of January, on my land, with a stranger kneeling over them? I didn't get any of that sorted in the moment. In the moment I just said, like a fool, "Ma'am," just that. "Ma'am." She didn't startle. That's the first thing I remember thinking about her. She didn't startle, though I'd come up nearly on top of her. She turned her head slow, and I saw her face for the first time. She was older than I'd guessed from the strength in her arms, lines at her eyes and mouth, gray threaded through the black hair that had come loose from its tie and frozen in stiff strands against her cheek. Her lips had gone a color lips shouldn't be. And her eyes, I'll never do this part justice. Her eyes weren't afraid and they weren't asking me for anything. They just measured me, took the whole of me in, the horse and the coat and the closed hard set of my face, and made some private decision, and then went right back down to the foal in her lap. "This one's the weakest," she said. Her English was quiet and careful and better than mine, if I'm honest. "The other 2 will hold a little longer. This one I don't know." That was all. No help me. No who are you. No thank God someone's come. Just a report, mare to mare, from one person doing hard work to another she'd apparently decided might be useful. I want to tell you I leapt down and threw my coat over the child and swept them all up onto my horse and rode for home. That's how it'd go in a story a man tells to make himself look good. What actually happened is that I sat up on Dell for a long, ugly moment doing arithmetic. 3 foals of unknown ownership. A strange woman, Chiricahua by her dress, on my land. The cold biting through my own good coat. Every mean and careful voice I'd built up over the years telling me this is not your trouble. This is not your trouble. Ride on. And then the foal in her lap gave a sound. A thin bleating wheeze, barely a sound at all. The sound a thing makes when it's got very little left. And she made a sound back low, in her own language, wordless, the kind of noise you make to a frightened animal or a sick child without deciding to. And something in me that I'd spent 5 years freezing over cracked clean down the middle. I got down off my horse. Getting all 3 foals and the woman up out of that swale took the better part of an hour and nearly killed all of us. I want to be plain about how bad it was. Because the movies make cold look like an inconvenience, and it is not. Cold is a hand around your throat. 20 minutes into the work my fingers had stopped being fingers. They were just hooks I could see but couldn't feel, and I kept dropping the rope and cursing and picking it up. The woman never cursed. She worked with a terrible economy, no motion wasted, and she was so much colder than me. She'd been out there since God knew when. She'd given her robe to a horse, and still she was steadier than I was. We couldn't carry the foals far in our arms. They were newborn, but a newborn horse is 30, 40 pounds of loose limbs, and the drifts were chest-deep in the swale. So we made a kind of drag out of my saddle blanket and the woman's frozen robe, and we hauled them up one at a time to the wind-scoured bench where Dell stood stamping, and then it was the question of the horse. Dell would not at first take the smell of them. Foals in distress smell like death, and old Dell wanted no part of death that morning. He danced and threw his head, and I nearly lost him twice down the slope. It was the woman who quieted him. She left the foals a moment, a decision that must have cost her, given the weakest one's state, and came and stood at Dell's head and put her frozen hand flat on his nose and said something to him. I don't know what. I don't know if it was words or just breath. But my 11-year-old horse, who trusts 3 people in this world and no strangers at all, dropped his head and blew out a long breath and stood. She had a way with frightened things. I'd see it again and again over those 3 days, and I never stopped marveling at it. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't the sentimental Indian whisperer nonsense the dime novels peddled. It was attention. She simply paid closer attention to the creature in front of her than anyone I'd ever met paid to anything. She noticed the exact moment the fear was about to break one way or the other, and she put her weight on the right side of it. That's all courage is, I've come to think. Attention, and the willingness to spend yourself on what you notice. We got the 2 stronger foals slung across Dell's back, one on each side, lashed with what rope I had, and the woman walked at his head holding them steady. The weakest one, the one from her lap, she carried herself, wrapped against her chest, refusing to let me take it even though I was warmer and stronger, and it made no sense. I understand it now. That foal was hers by then, not by ownership. By the debt you take on when you've breathed into something to keep it breathing. You don't hand that over. We made my home place a little before noon. 2 miles that took us 3 hours. By the end I was weeping from the cold and didn't know it until the tears froze and pulled at my face, and the woman was gray-lipped and swaying, and only the foals, dear God, the foals, were doing better than when we'd started, warmed by the horse and the movement, and this stranger's fierce refusal to let the mountain have them. I'll tell you now the thing I learned about how 3 newborn foals came to be alone in a January drift, because it explains her. And it's the part that people always go quiet at when I tell it. They weren't mine. I'd been wrong about that. They belonged to no one or to her, depending on how you counted. Over that first night, thawing by my stove, she told it to me in pieces, in that careful, quiet English, watching my face the whole time to see what I'd do with it. Her people had been moved. Again. That word did a lot of work when she said it, moved, and I didn't ask what it covered because I could see it covered a great deal and none of it good. In the moving, in the confusion of families and soldiers and a hard early winter, a small band of horses had been separated and lost. 3 mares, heavy and foal, driven off in the chaos and never recovered. She'd known those mares. They'd been her family's, her grandfather's line, horses her people had bred for longer than my people had been in that country. And when the storm came on, she'd done a thing that I still can't fully hold in my head. She'd gone back. Out of the low camp where it was merely miserable, up into the high country where it was murder, alone, on foot, into a blizzard, to look for 3 horses that any sane person would have written off. She found the mares dead. All 3. They'd foaled in the storm, early, forced by the cold and the terror, and then they died, the way mares will when everything goes wrong at once. And she'd found the 3 foals alive in the snow beside their dead mothers, and she had done the only thing her particular heart would let her do, which was to sit down in that killing cold and start rubbing life back into them one at a time, with no plan, no shelter, no way home, and no reason on God's earth to think anyone would ever come. You went back, I said. I remember saying it stupidly like it was a thing that needed confirming. For the horses. Alone. She looked at me a long moment across my own stove, in my own house, wrapped in my dead wife's quilt because her robe was a frozen ruin on the porch. And she said a thing I have carried with me for the rest of my life. They didn't have anyone else, she said. Someone has to be the one who comes back. If nobody is ever the one who comes back, and here she stopped and looked at the 3 foals bedded in straw by my stove, all 3 alive, all 3 breathing, the weakest one lifting its head now to look at the light, then what are we for? It wasn't a question. She didn't say it like a question. She said it like a plain fact about the shape of the world, a thing so obvious to her she was almost embarrassed to be explaining it to a grown man. What are we for? I did not have an answer. I have spent years trying to build one worthy of the question. The weakest foal, she called it in her language, a word she translated for me as something close to the one who was almost water, because it had come so near to melting away into the snow. That foal was the crisis of the first night. Twice I thought it had died. Twice its breathing went so shallow and slow that I stood up from my chair, ready to carry the little body out to the cold barn so she wouldn't have to watch it go by the stove. Both times she stopped me with a hand, and both times she went to work warming milk I didn't know how to make suitable for a foal until she showed me, coaxing it drop by drop past lips that didn't want to take it, holding the small head up, breathing on the cold ears, keeping up a low, steady stream of that wordless sound that I'd first heard in the swale. She did not sleep that night. I tried to spell her, tried to take a watch so she could rest, and she let me sit by the foal for an hour while she closed her eyes, but I could tell she wasn't sleeping. She was resting the way a cat rests, all of her still ready. Toward dawn, and this is the moment I'd put in a frame and hang on the wall if a moment could be framed, the weak foal stood up. It shouldn't have. It had no business standing. But somewhere in that last dark hour before the light it decided it wasn't going to be water after all, and it gathered its impossible legs under it, and it heaved itself up, swaying and knock-kneed and absurd, and it stood there in the straw by my stove in the gray dawn light, alive, looking around at the world with the total astonishment of a thing that had almost not been. The woman made a sound then that I hadn't heard from her before, a small broken laugh, half a sob, quickly swallowed. She put her hand over her mouth, and I saw, because I was watching her and not the foal, I saw how much it had cost her to be certain the whole night, how much she'd been holding the outcome up by force of will alone, and how the standing of that one small horse let her set the weight down at last. She'd been so steady. She'd been steady for so long. And it was the good news that finally cracked her. The way it does, you can carry disaster on a straight back for days, and then one small mercy will put you on your knees. I looked away. It seemed like the decent thing to let her have that minute unwatched. I looked out my window at the sun coming up gold over all that murderous white, and I got out my green book without quite meaning to, and I opened it to write the number 3 foals, saved, because that's what I did with the world. I turned it into numbers. And I found I couldn't. The pencil hung there over the page, 3 foals saved. It was true, and it was nothing. It didn't hold 1/100th of what had happened in my house that night. Someone has to be the one who comes back. You can't put that in a green book. I closed it and put it away, and I have to tell you, I never really used it the same way again. Word of a thing like that doesn't stay on one ranch. This is the part where the valley comes in. And I have to back up and tell you what my valley was like before, so you understand why what happened next was close to a miracle. Ashwater Valley in those years was not a warm place, and I don't mean the weather. We were a scattered handful of ranch families, some there a generation, some fresh off the wagon roads, and we did not love each other. There'd been water fights, literal fights, with fists, and once with a shotgun that, thank God, missed, over the Ashwater Creek in dry years. There were fence-line grudges going back to before I was born. And laid over all of it, thick as the snow, was the hard suspicion between the ranch families and the Chiricahua camp in the low country, a suspicion I'd done my full share to feed. We were, in short, exactly the kind of people who would have let 3 foals and a strange woman freeze to death 40 miles away and never lost a night's sleep over it. That was who we were. So when I rode down to the Haverson place 2 days later, the storm having finally broken enough to travel, to see about borrowing a proper foaling setup and some mare's milk replacer, and old Bern Haverson asked me what in the world I needed all that for in January, I found myself telling him. The whole thing. The swale, the woman on her knees, the robe she gave to a horse. Someone has to be the one who comes back. I hadn't planned to. It just came out of me, all of it, standing in Bern's cold barn with my hat in my hands. And Bern Havorson, who was a harder man than me and no friend to the Chiricahua camp, stood there a long time. And then he said, well, and then he said, I've got a stall that's warmer than yours, Elias. And I've got a granddaughter who's near about useless at anything but doctoring sick lambs, and she'd walk through this snow barefoot for a chance at 3 orphan foals. And he started pulling supplies off his shelf and loading them into my arms before I'd even asked. That's how it went. That's how it went all up and down the valley over the next week, as the roads opened and the story traveled and got told and retold at the feed store, and the church and across fence lines that hadn't had a kind word cross them in years. It turned out that near about everybody, underneath the suspicion and the grudges and the hard, careful arithmetic we all ran, was carrying around the same secret shame, the knowledge that we'd become people who wouldn't have gone back. And here was a woman, one of the people we'd worked hardest not to see, who had gone back, alone, into a blizzard, for animals that weren't even her own by the paper we set such store by. She shamed us, but it was the good kind of shame, the kind that doesn't crush you but lifts you, because it shows you a better version of yourself that you'd thought was gone and turns out was only sleeping. Every family in that valley, I think, looked at what she'd done and thought, privately, I used to be someone who would have gone back. When did I stop? Can I start again? And one by one, in the small stubborn ways of hard country people who'd never say a soft word out loud, they started again. The Havorsons sent the milk and the warm stall. The widow Christine sent blankets and a pot of something with actual meat in it, the first meat that woman had parted with in living memory. Young Tom Farrell, who I'd once threatened over a strayed steer, rode 2 hours through the snow to bring a foaling harness and stayed to muck stalls and never asked for a thing. And they came over that week, not just with goods but with themselves. They came to my place to see her, the way you travel to see a thing you didn't quite believe was real. And she met all of them the same way she'd met me in the swale. No performance, no thanks demanded. She just showed them the foals and let them help, and paid them that same close, terrible attention she paid to everything, so that a man who'd ridden out of curiosity rode home 2 hours later feeling, for reasons he couldn't name, like he'd been genuinely seen for the first time in years. I watched my valley change around a woman whose name I still, at that point, did not know, and I was ashamed to ask it so late. I asked it anyway, on the 7th night, as the 3 foals dozed fat and warm in Bern Havorson's good stall and half, the valley's womenfolk argued companionably in my kitchen over the right way to blanket a young horse. I asked her name. She told me. It was long, and it was in her language, and it held, she explained, the name of her grandfather, who had been a man the soldiers had a different name for, a name I recognized, and that put a cold weight in my stomach, because I knew what my people had done to the man who carried it. She watched me recognize it. She watched me understand exactly who I was standing in a warm kitchen next to, and exactly what my kind had done to hers. You can call me Sessa, she said, giving me the short of it, the easy part, and I understood it for the mercy it was. She was making it simple for me, the way she'd made the milk simple, the way she'd quieted my horse. She was, even then, even knowing what I was, still paying attention to what I could carry. I have never in my life felt so small, and so strangely, painfully grateful to be made small by someone. The foals lived, all 3. The one who was almost water grew into the strongest of them, in the way of things that come the closest to dying. That's how part 1 of it ends, I suppose, though it isn't really an ending, it's the false calm before the part of the story that costs something. Because a warm January week could not stay warm. and a valley that had come together around 3 saved foals and a woman who shamed us into being better, was about to be tested by the question that always comes next, the hard one, the real one. Whether it would last, whether we'd meant it, or whether, come spring, when the snow melted and the water fights started up again and Sessa's people were moved one more time, we'd go right back to being the kind of people who don't go back. I wish I could tell you we all passed that test. I can't. Spring came the way it always comes to the Ashwater, too fast and too wet, the snow going off the high country all at once, so the creek ran gray and swollen and mean, and every old grievance thawed right along with the ground. I should have known it wouldn't hold. The foals were 4 months old by then and the pride of the whole valley, in a way I still find hard to explain to people who weren't there. Folks would ride over just to look at them in Bern Havorson's paddock, 3 young horses, sound and glossy, and full of that leggy foal foolishness, alive because one woman had knelt in the snow and refused the mountain its due. Children named them. There were arguments, good-natured, over which was finest. The one who was almost water, Sessa, still called him by the word for it, and so did the rest of us, until Water was just his name, had grown into a tall, dark colt with a white sock and an attitude, and he was everybody's favorite, and I loved him more than I've ever admitted to a living soul. Sessa stayed the winter. Not in my house, that wouldn't have been right, and neither of us wanted the talk, but in the low camp, and she came up near every week to see the foals, and the valley folk got so they looked forward to it. She doctored a sick animal while she was up, wouldn't take pay for it, taught the Havorson granddaughter more about horses in 4 months than the girl had learned in her whole life. She became, without anybody deciding it, a person the valley leaned on. And I let myself believe, this is the part I'm ashamed of, I let myself believe we'd become good, that the winter had changed us for keeps. Then the paper came. I'll keep the government part short because you know how it went. Everybody knows how it went, even if we don't like to say it plainly. There was a paper, and the paper said the Chiricahua camp in the low country was to be moved, that word again, moved south and east, to land nobody had seen, on a schedule nobody had asked about, by men who'd never set foot in the Ashwater and never would. Sessa's people. The camp that had become, over one strange winter, something almost like neighbors. And here is where the story stops being about 3 foals in the snow and starts being about who we really were, underneath the good week we'd had. Because when the paper came, the valley split. Some of us, and I'll put my own name at the head of this list, though I came to it slower than I should have, some of us said no. Said it out loud, which in that country and that year took more than I'd have credited myself with. We rode to the county seat, a delegation of ranchers who 6 months before wouldn't have shared a fence line. And we stood in a cold office, and we said these people are our neighbors and they've done no harm, and one of them saved animals half of you wouldn't have crossed the road for. And you are not going to move them, not through our valley, not with our silence. And some of us, and these were men I'd called friends, men who'd sent blankets and meat and mucked my stalls all winter, some of us went quiet, looked at their boots, did the arithmetic I knew so well because I'd run it my whole life. The arithmetic that ends with this is not my trouble, ride on. Not cruel, most of them, just afraid and tired and long practiced at not seeing what it cost too much to see. That was the test, not the blizzard. The blizzard was easy in a way. A blizzard asks you a simple question, and there's a warm answer and a cold one. This was the hard test, the slow one, the one with no drama to it. Whether the good you'd found in a warm barn in January would survive contact with your own fear and your own comfort in the gray light of an ordinary spring afternoon. We did not all pass. I told you that at the end of part 1, and I'll hold to it. We did not all pass. Sessa knew the paper had come before I did. Of course she did. It was her people, her family, her grandfather's name on the wrong side of the old ledger yet again. When I rode down to the low camp to find her full of my delegation and my speeches and my new-minted courage, she was already packing. Not fleeing. Packing. slow and careful and with that same terrible economy of motion I'd first seen in the swale, folding a life into what could be carried. "You don't have to go," I said. I remember how stupid it sounded even as I said it, standing there on my good horse with my good intentions. "We're fighting it. Half the valley's fighting it. Burns with us and the Farrells and—" "I know," she said. She didn't stop packing. "I know you are. It matters that you are." She looked up at me then, and her face had that measuring quality again, the one from the swale, taking the whole of me in and making some private assessment. "But you will lose, Elias. Not because you're weak. Because the thing you're fighting doesn't live in your valley. It lives a long way off in offices, and it has all the time in the world, and you have cattle to run and a short spring to run them in." She was right. I knew she was right. I hated that she was right. "Then what was it for?" I said, and my voice cracked on it, and I heard in my own mouth the echo of her question from the winter, thrown back at her now, twisted. "What are we for?" "The whole winter, the foals, all of it. If it just, what was any of it for if this is how it ends anyway?" And she stopped packing. She stood up, and she came over, and she put her hand flat on my horse's nose the way she'd done in the swale, and my horse dropped his head and blew out his breath the way he always did for her, and she looked up at me over his nose. "You think it ends," she said. "That's your trouble. You've always counted things like they stop." She almost smiled. "The foals don't end because I leave. You don't end because I leave. What happened in your barn in January doesn't unhappen because a paper says I'm to be somewhere else." She took her hand off my horse. "I gave 3 foals their lives back. You can't count that and then subtract it. It doesn't work like your green book. Once a thing is saved, it stays saved. Even after everything else is lost. I have thought about that every day for 30 years. Once a thing is saved, it stays saved. I don't know if I believe it. I want to. Some days I do." They moved the camp in May. I'll tell it fast because Sessa would want it told fast. She had no patience for people wallowing in a grief to make themselves feel deep. The delegation lost, the way she said we would. The offices had all the time in the world and we had a short spring. Bern Haverson wept openly at the county seat, a hard old man crying in public, and it did no good. Tom Farrell said things to a government man that could have gotten him jailed, and it did no good. I stood in the road as the wagons went through the valley, and I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to make sure that every single family in the Ashwater, the ones who'd fought and the ones who'd gone quiet both, stood in that road with me, so that Sessa's people would go out of our valley through a corridor of faces, and not through an empty land that had already forgotten them. Most of the valley came, even the quiet ones. That's the thing I hold on to, that when it came down to standing in a road, even the men who'd looked at their boots came and stood. It didn't stop anything, but it wasn't nothing. Sessa had taught us that much at least, that being the one who comes, who witnesses, who refuses to let a thing happen in the dark and the silence, that it isn't nothing, even when it isn't enough. And here is the part I've been walking toward this whole long time. The part that's the real reason I've told this story 100 times, and will tell it 100 more. The foals. They belonged to Sessa. Everyone knew it, whatever the paper might have said. They were her grandfather's line, bred by her people before mine came to that country, and she had earned them 3 times over on her knees in the snow. When the wagons rolled, those 3 young horses were hers to take, and a lesser story would end with her leading them out of the valley behind the wagons, and it would be sad and it would be right. That is not what she did. She left them. She came to me the night before the move, up at Burns' paddock in the long spring dusk, and she stood at the fence looking at Water and his 2 sisters running in the last light, and she told me she was leaving them in the valley. With us. With me. I argued. God, I argued. They're yours, I said. You earned them, you saved them. They're the only thing you've got left of your grandfather's line. You can't just... And she let me run all the way down, the way she let frightened horses run down, and when I'd finished she said, "Where I'm going, I don't know the land, I don't know the water or the grass or how the winter comes. I could take them into that not knowing, and maybe they'd live and maybe they wouldn't." She watched water buck and wheel in the dusk. Or I could leave them here in a valley that knows them, with people who love them, on grass I've seen them fat on. I could leave them somewhere I know they're safe. She turned to me. You saved them too, Elias. You got off your horse in the swale. You didn't have to. You leave that part out when you tell it, but I was there. I saw you decide. I couldn't speak. Someone has to be the one who comes back, she said. I was that in the snow. Now I need you to be that for them for as long as they live. That's what I'm leaving you, not 3 horses. A reason to be the one who comes back every day for years, long after I'm gone and you can't remember my face. She almost smiled again. You'll forget my face. You will, but you won't forget them. And through them you'll remember the thing that matters, which was never me. The wagons left the next morning. She walked out of the Ashwater Valley the way she'd walked into that swale, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away, her back straight under a weight I couldn't see the whole of. She did not look back at the foals. I understood why. Looking back would have been for her, and Sessa never in her life did a single thing that was only for her. She'd left them where they'd be safe, and to look back would have been to take something for herself out of the leaving, and she wouldn't. I looked back for her. I stood at that paddock fence and I watched the wagons out of sight, and then I watched the empty road a long time after. And Water came up behind me and put his big dark head over my shoulder the way he'd done since he was small. And I stood there with a saved horse's breath warm on my neck, and I wept like the winter had finally gotten into me after all. The foals lived long lives. I kept my promise, if you can call it a promise, when it was really just the shape my whole self took after that spring. Water lived to be 26, which is old for a horse, and he sired a line that's still in this valley. There are horses grazing the Ashwater right now, this very morning, with his blood and his white sock and his temper, and every one of them traces back to a newborn who was almost water melting into the January snow, and to a woman who knelt down and decided he wasn't going to be. I never saw Sessa again. I don't know what became of her people in the land they were moved to. I tried for years to find out, wrote letters that went into the same offices that had all the time in the world, and I learned nothing, which I've come to understand was the point of those offices. She's gone now, surely. She was older than me and I'm an old man. She's been gone a long time. She was right that I'd forget her face. I have. I'm ashamed of it, but it's true. I can't call up her features anymore, the exact lines of her, the color of her eyes. 30 years wore them away. But she was right about the other thing too. I never forgot the horses. And through the horses I never forgot the thing that mattered, which she told me was never her. It was the plain, terrible, world-shaped fact she said in my kitchen on the 7th night. The one I've spent the rest of my life failing to live all the way up to and refusing to stop trying. That someone has to be the one who comes back. That if nobody is ever the one who comes back, then we are not for anything at all. I got off my horse in the swale. It's the best thing I ever did, and I nearly didn't do it, and I've built the whole rest of my life on the version of me that did. The green book's in a drawer somewhere. I haven't kept a tally in 30 years. There are some things you can't count. She taught me that. In the snow, with 3 tiny fillies and a courage that had no bottom to it, a woman I can no longer picture and will never, as long as I breathe, forget.